is, let's assume that I'm charging whatever percentage. It says the commission, which includes both my commission on the listing side, and possibly the commission for the buyer side. So in the new form that comes out, then I'm going to be attaching the brokerage, because now the brokerage is essentially paying the commission, as opposed to if, let's say, my only commission is whatever percent. It doesn't include the buyer side. Then I'm going to be including on 12(1)(b) how much that commission is going to be, because there's no commission that's allotted to the brokerage for the buyer's agent. I hope I'm explaining it correctly. It's a little bit.
I know you're confusing the rest here. I think you have it. I'll go over it today as well. But like I said, today's kind of like that came out yesterday. It's supposed to clarify things for everybody. It's definitely opened some things up, removed some forms for us as far as required stuff. I want to cover that, and then I'm going to follow up with some videos individually, and I'll talk about that in a second. But we'll get there. But yes,
Russell, stop confusing us, okay?
And I saw Don jump on here real quick. Don, you here?
Yes, sir.
Well, say hi real quick, everybody. This is you guys get the first taste before anybody else does. Don Leonard will be starting next week as our new assistant broker. So, say hi to Don, everybody.
Hi, Don.
Hi. Good morning, everybody.
Hi, Don.
So, Don. Let me add these people in here real quick. Question. Okay, Lily, you got a question real quick before we start?
Sorry, I accidentally click it.
You're fine. It happens all the time. So, all right, let me do this real quick. Claudia's coming in. And we'll do an official announcement for Don on email. And we'll do it in the next meeting as well. And but thanks for joining us today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the invite.
Yep. And Don does classes for champions. He's an instructor. He's a mentor. He's a coach. He's a broker. So you guys will all get used to seeing him on these things as well, and a lot of our training. So I'm looking forward to having you on board. So
looking forward to it also. Thanks.
Awesome. Okay. I think we got the group in here now. I've started recording already. Good. I'm going to share my screen. I don't know what that is. So
interesting.
Yep. Is anybody not muted? Let's see here. That's you. I got it. There we go. Nice having the power difference. There we go. All right. One more coming in. All right. Thank you all for jumping on today. This is our Friday. We do our Friday lunch and learns, Friday fundamentals, and usually every other Friday I do a form. I'll cover like the backup addendum form. I'll cover a subject to sale of a property form. Or I'll do parts of the 1 to 4 or whatever. I figured today was a great time, since yesterday I sent out the email about the clarification around broker compensation and the forms to use. We've gotten a lot of calls at the broker line from other brokers, how they interpret how to use the forms correctly. And I've gotten to good sized discussions with a few of them about how I see it versus how they see it. I'm glad that Texas Realtors came out and said, this is the way the forms are written, and how Trex forms and Texas Realtor forms should work together. And so I wanted to share that with you guys today, and kind of do an overview and follow up with more detailed training if possible. So as people are still jumping in, give them a chance here. All right. So on that note, most of you, if not all of you, check your email. I did put chunked it out and put some verbiage around the letter from Texas Realtors about the changes and what to do. They gave scenarios. It's not the clearest thing in the world, but that's why we're doing this. Okay. So items to follow. There's a couple things I'm going to follow up with early next week. Will be in your Real Smart Agent education videos. I'm going to do a video specifically on working with a buyer, compensation conversations from A to Z. That's going to be one video, just kind of walk you through, if you're working with a buyer, where to start. I'm going to do another video with I'm working with a seller, compensation conversation, the steps A to Z as well. And then, of course, I'm the only agent in the transaction. We deal with this a lot. The same thing, compensation A to Z, how to navigate that, conversations to use, and the forms to use for that. Obviously, I'm going to update an updated sample purchase agreement in your Real Smart Agent download section. There's one there now. I have to update it with the new language. I will put in an updated sample buyer tenant rep agreement for your reference as well. And of course, we've just booked all of our classes for the remainder of the year. And we have contract classes, we have legal classes, we have addendum classes, we have a compensation agreement classes that you get credit for. So all of that will be coming down the line. So you will be well taken care of as far as the education goes. And okay, moving on. All right. Just wanted to go back to basics. What do we have to start with? When you're working with a buyer, and this is what we require anyway. This is what you need regardless. You guys know this already, but on the buyer side, you need a buyer tenant rep, a 1501 before you show properties. You have to have a conversation around compensation. We require the general information and notice to buyers, same time, and we require the IABS, which buyers. Those are all your basic forms. Your IABS discloses what agency is and the different choices a buyer or seller may have, or landlord or tenant. Your general information and notice is CYA. It's all the things a buyer may be exposed to or seller during a transaction they should be aware of. And of course, your buyer tenant rep is your compensation agreement, how you get paid, about the relationship. They know about agency. They know about their choices. They know about the things they should be watching out for and the benefit of working with you as an agent. We sign a buyer tenant rep agreement. That's the beginnings. And on the flip side, the seller side, it's the exact same thing. The rentals and apartments, yes. Kimla, the law changes in lawsuit exempt rentals, but we require it on rentals as well. It's the best practice to have your buyer tenant rep agreement in place, regardless of rentals or sales. Okay, on the sales side, same thing. You have your residential real estate listing agreement, exclusive right to sell or exclusive right to lease, TXR 1101, which is your buyer tenant rep on the seller side. Your general information and notice to sellers, same thing, giving them notice. Your IABS as well, talking about their choice from agency. And of course, we've added one now that this is one we've had for a while. It's the seller's authorization to release and advertise certain information. So if they're going to be offering a compensation to a buyer broker or to a buyer in the form of concessions, there's no other way for us to release that information unless they give us authorization. So that's a TXR 1417. But those are the same on either side. You're talking about agency, you're talking about what the buyer or seller needs to know, and you're establishing an agency relationship with your client. Pretty straightforward. That hasn't changed. The forms and the conversations around those forms is what's changed. And we were updating that today, making it more clear, hopefully. Okay. On the buy side, we all know this. We've covered this on several classes, but on the buyer tenant rep agreement, the one where you talk to the buyer about how you get paid, it says you cannot receive more than what you have on your buyer tenant rep agreement. We have a lot of agents calling, well, can I put zero? Well, if you want to make zero, then fine. But that limits how much you can make. So the idea is this is what I make, whatever that may be. And then my job is to transfer that liability to the seller or listing broker or whatever in cases. We'll go over that in a second. But in many cases lately, a builder, a seller, or listing agent will request a copy of your buyer tenant rep agreement. Because the way things are worded in the purchase agreement now is that the seller's concession to the buyer broker offsets the amount the buyer actually owes the buyer broker. Okay, so they want to see how much they're offsetting. This removes the buyer's obligation to pay the buyer broker, but it also, they want to know how much they're actually covering. Okay, so make sure we know that. So what do we do as buyer brokers? We've got our buyer broker agreement with our buyer in place. We've gone over our TXR 1506 and our IABS, and we're out shopping for properties. We find a property the buyer likes and wants to make an offer on. We contact the listing broker, as we always have since the changes have been in place. And we're asking, is the seller offering buyer broker compensation? If they have a TXR 1417 in place, they can let us know. And then if they say yes or no, you also ask the question, are you, the listing broker, offering buyer broker compensation through your listing agreement? When you fill out your listing agreement, did it include an amount that you were going to give to a buyer broker? So those are important questions to ask because it makes a difference on how you write your offer now. Now, if the seller, if seller is yes, meaning the agent says yes, the seller is offering buyer broker compensation, great. That they made it very easy for us. We're going to fill out section 12, 1AB, and say this is the seller's agreed to pay this amount, and we're putting it in the contract between buyer and seller that seller is paying buyer broker, and that's it. Okay. If the seller is a no, but the agent said yes, it's in my listing agreement where I have a portion of what I'm making from the seller to pay a buyer broker, then you're going to send over a TXR 2402, an agreement between brokers. And then you're going to disclose that TXR 2402 in place on page 10 only, and you're going to leave section 12 blank. Okay. If both are no, seller's not offering buyer broker compensation and the listing agent's not offering buyer broker compensation, you still use section 12 because now you're trying to negotiate in the contract to get the seller to pay the buyer broker compensation. And if that you cannot do that in the contract and they do not agree to it, the buyer is obligated to pay you. So that you've done your job is to try to get the seller or the listing broker to pay it, and then you're doing it in the contract. If all those fail, that buyer needs to understand that they owe you, the buyer broker, the compensation they agreed to pay in your buyer broker agreement. Now, that's the hardest part for all of our agents to deal with. It's like, all right, you got to know your value. What do you make? Okay. All right. So this is not changed. This is your buyer broker compensation. This is your TXR 1501, the long form. A reminder, this was the addition to the lawsuits, to the settlement, I should say, that broker compensation or sharing a compensation between brokers is not set by law or fixed, control, recommended, or suggested by the Association of Realtors. MLS or any listing service and so on, broker compensation is fully negotiable. Brokers independently determine their fees. Brokers prohibited from receiving compensation for brokerage services from any source that exceeds the amount in this statement. Again, you're letting your buyer know that I cannot receive any more than I put down in this form that you're obligated to pay. In the event you get a BTSA from a builder or an increase, some kind of bonus, you have to amend your buyer tenant rep agreement with a TXR 1505 to allow for, and the buyer has to sign it, allowing you to receive more. Okay. And then you have the percentage of the sales price or percentage of the lease. And then the paragraph B there is very clear. Broker will seek to obtain payment of the fees specified in paragraph 7A, which is above, first from the seller, landlord, or their agents. So they're trying, that's what we're doing. That's your job, is to see if you can get this paid for by the listing broker, by the seller, by the landlord, or in the contract. If such persons refuse or fail to pay the broker amount specified, client will pay broker the amount specified less any amounts broker receives from such persons. So if the buyer, if you put free apples, 3% here, and the seller pays you 2%, the buyer owes you the remainder of the 3%. You don't have to take it all. You can always take less, and that is up to you and your buyer, but you can't take more. So this is why they need a copy of this to see how much of this is being offset by what's coming from the listing broker or the seller. Okay, pretty straightforward. This hasn't changed, but I want to make sure that we always start with our buyer tenant rep agreement. This is the beginning of everything when we're dealing with a purchase agreement. Now we're going to the purchase. This is the listing agreement. So for our listing agents, the conversation may change. We're so used in many cases to filling out a listing agreement between a seller and a listing broker and saying, all right, the total amount, which is paragraph A of compensation, is the amount you're making charging to list a property and share with a buyer broker. So on paragraph 5A1, you're saying this is like the 6% for the total amount. And out of that 6% in 5A2, I'm going to share half of that, third of that, whatever you choose to do with a buyer broker. This is the way we've been doing it for years, but this is one option now. This is something that, as a listing broker, you're talking to a seller, because once again, all commission, all compensation is negotiable, and sharing a cooperate or broker compensation is not required. Okay, so the seller, if they want to, for the purposes of a marketing tool, as a listing broker, I say, hey, look, I know that if I advertise and let people know that you're offering X amount towards a buyer broker, it's in my agreement. It helps me market your property to more buyers and hopefully get a higher offer price and more eyeballs on your property. Okay, that's option A. So if option A is done by the listing broker, where they built in a broker compensation for a buyer broker, what's a buyer broker going to find out? They're going to say, yep, it's in my listing agreement. They're going to send over a 2402, get an agreement between brokers, and they're going to fill out that information on page 10, but they're going to leave section 12 blank because the seller is not paying the buyer broker directly. The buyer broker is being paid through the listing agreement by the listing broker. Now, listing broker, if the seller says, I want to pay you, but I want to negotiate or not obligate myself to pay a buyer broker, which we're seeing, it would be choice B. B is where they would list the property and say, this is what I'm charging. You pay me X amount at closing when your property sells. Knowing that a buyer broker may approach you or put it in the contract, about. And if the seller said, I would consider offering X amount to a buyer broker, but I don't want to put it in this agreement, then you as the buyer, the listing broker, with a signed 1417 can disclose to potential buyer brokers that it's not in my listing agreement, it's not coming through me, the listing broker, but the seller could and may consider paying up to a certain amount. Then you would put it in section 12 of the purchase agreement. Now, pretty straightforward, but that's the question you ask from the listing broker. What's your listing agreement say? Do you have in your listing agreement an amount that you're going to pay and share with a buyer broker, or do you have nothing in there where the seller is willing if it's negotiated? And then you have those two choices of how you operate your offer. Okay, so paragraph 12, which was what we've been confused about, we know that they've added line B. Line B, when you look at it, it says you have seller expenses and you have buyer expenses. Let's just look at this for a second. Paragraph A1 says the following expenses must be paid at or prior to closing. Seller shall pay the following expenses. Goes on to say release of existing liens, prepayment penalties, and so on and so on. It says, and brokerage fees that seller has agreed to pay, okay, by the seller under this contract. Paragraph B says the following amount to be applied to the brokerage fees that the buyer has agreed to pay. A lot of our agents get confused by this. Remember, what we're trying to do is get the seller or the listing broker to offset what the buyer broker owes. The buyer owes to the buyer broker. So what we're saying here is seller is paying 3% that goes towards the 3% that the buyer owed us, which means the buyer is no longer obligated to pay us because the seller has met that need. They've fulfilled the buyer's obligation. That's what this is saying. But now we're only using this though if the seller has agreed to pay us. Either the seller in the contract verbally through a agreement, or we're negotiated in. If the listing broker is paying us, we would leave this blank. Paragraph line C there, right below that, is still there from the past if you are negotiating seller concessions directly to the buyer, not the buyer broker, to the buyer. So closing costs or whatever. So it is confusing, but they've clarified that we're only using this is if the seller is giving concessions to the buyer broker directly or the buyer directly. If the listing broker is doing it, we're not using this. All right. Hopefully that's clear. Now, the 2402, it's limited time. We only use this if the listing broker has a listing agreement where it includes a sharing of commission with a buyer broker. And then we want to secure this in writing. Why this is important is the listing, they have an agreement, but there's no place in the contract for us to negotiate that amount except for here. We reference it in paragraph 10 saying that we have this outside agreement. So if the listing broker is saying, yep, I'm paying it through my listing agreement, we want to secure that with the listing broker in a written agreement to secure that, make sure you get paid. And then we disclose that in paragraph 10. Because we're not putting in 12. 12 is part of the contract between buyer and seller. We're only disclosing that this agreement exists. That's why it's so important. We've had agents not have this, go to closing, and then they had to argue about how they're deserving a commission. And the seller and the listing broker weren't obligated to pay the listing broker, and the buyer ended up being on the hook for paying the buyer broker. So we want to make sure that doesn't happen. All right. What I said, page 10 in the past was more of just a open disclosure. It wasn't something, it's not part of the contract necessarily. It's still an information page. The buyer does not sign this. The seller doesn't sign this, but it's a disclosure to the parties that there's an outside agreement. If you look at it, it says disclosure. Pursuant to a previous separate agreement, listing broker has agreed to pay other broker a fee of blank amount. This disclosure is for informational purposes only and does not change the previous agreement between brokers to pay or share a commission. This right here is just, it's for everybody to know that you have a 2402 in place, okay? So make sure you get one in place and you're not putting, so the problems we're seeing is where people are filling out the 3% in the section 12 and they're putting 3% in page 10, which they conflict each other. So we don't want that, okay? So the letter sent out by the Texas Realtors yesterday was talking about the clarification around using section 12. And so hopefully that I did an overview there. But it talks about you start off with your buyer-tenant rep agreement, you start off with your listing agreement, and then how you navigate the purchase agreement goes down to the point where, okay, are we using section 12, 12.1b, 12a1b is the only time we use that are two ways. One, the seller has agreed to pay the buyer broker directly, and there is no sharing from a listing broker, or no one's agreed to, and we're trying to negotiate the seller to pay the buyer broker commission fees to take that obligation off the buyer broker. Okay, that was a question. That's the only time we're using 12. Listing broker compensation obviously will be directed by the listing agreement. The buyer broker compensation, they can be paid in many different ways. They can be paid by the buyer, they can be paid by the seller, they can be paid by the listing broker, they can be paid by a combination of any of the above. Okay. So once again, I went through 7B there. Make sure we're doing our buyer, having a great conversation with our buyers before we go shopping about how you get paid, how you'll try to get the seller, listing broker, or negotiate that so they don't have to pay it, but they are ultimately responsible for making sure you get compensated. And of course, the listing broker, of course, it reminds everybody here that a TXR 2402 is in place. If the listing broker has a listing agreement where they're sharing compensation and they've let you know because they've been given permission by the seller, by the TXR 1417 to share that information, your job as a buyer broker is to reach out to them with a 2402 to make sure it gets signed so that you get paid. Escrow needs the title and escrow at closing need these copies to make sure that they have permission to pay you the amount you are entitled to. Otherwise, the buyer, I should say. All right, I'll go down through here. Different options that we talked about in the email, and they give scenarios. The scenarios I'll do in another video as well, but sometimes you may need more than one. This listing broker may be offering through their listing agreement 2%, but the buyer owes you 3%. This is one of those weird scenarios. Okay, fine. You have a TXR 2402 in place for the 2% with the listing broker, and then the buyer can pay the difference if they want to or can, great. Or you can put in section 12, 1% that the seller would pay the difference of what the listing broker is paying you and what the buyer, is still obligated to pay. So that's where you have a combination. That's why we don't cover those at first. These are the ones where you want to call your broker team, which will be me and Don when he gets on board. When these scenarios come up, make sure we help you navigate them correctly so that when you have a combination of people paying the buyer broker's fees, we want to make sure that you're aware of that and using the proper process. Any comments, Don? I know you're not on the hook here. I'm just saying you're not even on the clock, so.
Nope. All pretty clear.
Okay.
Actually, I liked that what they put in section 12. I think eventually we're going to evolve into that anyway. So, yeah.
I agree. Eventually, it's going to be one of those points that we'll have our buyer broker agreement, we'll have our listing agreement, and then all the negotiation will be done right there. I agree. Yeah, eventually. And then obviously intermediary. Make sure that you all read your agency and intermediary policy. We allow it with restrictions and with the right paperwork. We ideally, especially dealing with compensation, dealing with people, there are better options. The first option is a buyer or seller, as long as disclosed, is allowed to not be represented. Okay. And we have disclosures for that. We always have great HomeSmart agents that you can refer the other party to and get a referral fee. Those are better options than an intermediary going forward. We'll talk about that at some other point. Okay, clarifications. All right, summary. Have your buyer tenant rep agreement complete before showing properties. You still can't receive more compensation than the buyer's obligated to pay you in the buyer tenant rep. So make sure you do that first. Call the listing broker and determine if the seller is offering buyer broker compensation, and is the listing broker paying that as part of the listing agreement, or if the seller agreeing to pay the buyer broker directly. Again, now if some listing brokers won't answer the call, and this is one of those questions we get a lot. They won't respond to you. This is where when you're writing an offer, you're going to have to use Section 12. You may have to amend it because if it is being paid by the listing broker, you'll have to amend and remove that and use the TXR 2402 and page 10. But if you don't know, that's where we would go, to Don's point. If the listing broker is sharing the compensation through the listing agreement, then you will need the 2402 signed between brokers, fill out Section 10 of the purchase agreement, and leave Section 12 blank. If the listing broker says the seller has agreed to pay the buyer broker compensation, then you'll fill out Section 12A1B only. No other forms are necessary. Leave page 10 blank. And of course, if multiple people are paying the buyer broker, then see the examples and of course call your broker. And if the buyer is paying the buyer broker compensation, then you don't need anything else in the contract referring to compensation. You would just need to provide the buyer tenant rep agreement to title so they know that the buyer is paying you directly, which has happened in some cases. All right. I'm going to stop this one. Now, I know these are changes to the process and the forms we use. I'm hoping that helped a little bit. We went through it fairly quickly, but really comes down to we're no longer using 2401 unless it's for sale by owner. That's gone away, which is super nice. You don't need that to get in place. Most of the time we're using paragraph 12 unless we know this listing broker is paying it, and we use the TXR 2402 and page 10. So clear as mud, as I promised, right? And this is recorded, so as you know, you can watch it on replay. And like I said, I promise that those videos I will put out will be up there by next week. So go through A to Z. Any questions, guys?
Mark,
Yes, RB.
Real quick. I'm sorry.
No, we got time. We're good.
Okay, so let me just paint a scenario, right? So I'm on the buyer side. We're talking to a listing agent, listed a property. The seller is only paying. Sorry, I got to use some percentage here so it doesn't get everybody confused. But for purposes of this, my fee is 3%. The seller is only willing to pay 2%, which is included in the listing agent's listing agreement. So I'm on the buyer side. I write an offer. So essentially, what I'm doing now, since my fee, after negotiation with the seller after the fact, the seller has agreed now to do two things. Number one, the seller has agreed to pay the difference of my commission. On top of that, the seller's also agreed to give the buyer some closing cost help. Let's say, $5,000.
Okay.
So on Section 12(1)(a)(b), I'm doing two things. Number one, since the seller has agreed to pay the difference of my commission, I'm putting 1% because 2% is the amount that's included in the listing agent's original listing agreement. And I'm also doing, maybe on top of that, maybe on below that, I can't remember now. I'm also adding $5,000 on B, 12(1)(b). No. Okay.
You're close. You're very, very close. So you just said that the listing broker has in their agreement 2% to the buyer broker.
Correct.
Okay. So you need a TXR 2402 with the listing broker, and you need to disclose on page 10 the 2% that the listing broker is paying you.
Okay.
The seller now has agreed to pay the difference of what the buyer owes you, which is 3%. So
1%.
on 12, so 12A1B you would put 1% in there.
Okay.
Which is the amount the seller is paying you directly to offset the buyer broker. And then in 12A1C, you would put the concessions of $5,000 to the buyer.
Gotcha.
So you were very, very close. Just the wording of it, yeah.
So that's kind of helpful because, on that scenario itself,
Mhm.
it kind of encapsulates essentially everything that, you're referring to, in terms of, okay, getting some conversation going with the listing agent if I'm on the buyer side. So, okay, what do you have? How much do you have in your agreement? My fee is so and so. Do you have that in your listing agreement? If the listing agent say, yes, I do, then I know exactly that I don't have to put that amount in the contract. And I can just, go to 24. But if the listing agent tells me otherwise, one or two things that, no, the seller's only paying my commission, then I know I have to put it on the 12A based on the conversation we have with the seller. The seller is paying me directly my commission.
Correct.
Or the scenario that we just described, which is, 3% is my fee. The seller say, no, I'm only going to do 2%. The buyer saying I can't do 1%. But based on the conversation, the seller says, okay, I'll make up the difference. Then I have to include it on the 12.
And the 12A1B obviously is negotiable. Think about that. You're asking the seller to pay the additional 1%. Seller may say no, because they're not obligated to pay it at that point in time, but it's negotiable. And then if they say no, then you go back to the buyer and you can take less, or the buyer can pay it, right? So, okay.
Got it. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, you're welcome. Andres.
Yes, on that scenario, the buyer can also say, no, he cannot, or he can perhaps not allow you to get compensation from the seller as well, correct? Or no?
No, they can't stop you from getting compensation up to the amount that they have in their buyer tenant rep agreement. They can stop you from getting more than you put on your buyer tenant rep agreement. Let's say that for a BTSA, or the seller wants to give you 4% versus 3%, then they have to agree to it. And they may want some of that. So, but no, if you say 3 on your agreement and the seller's willing, the listing brokers are willing to pay 3%, that just removes the obligation from the buyer, and they can't stop you from doing that.
Okay, thanks.
Yvonne?
Yes, Mari. I just want to see if this is doable. In that scenario, can the listing agent amend his listing and instead of 2% do it the 3%, and that way they can avoid to do the on the contract 1%? So if they're already agreed to move to 3%, I mean, I'm just thinking it's easier to do that way or not.
You certainly could. The listing broker could amend the listing agreement with the seller and then offer a 2402 to the buyer broker for the increased amount. And then you would just close it on page 10 and you would avoid paragraph 12. Yeah. Yeah. There's different ways to skin the rabbit or cat or whatever they call it, right? Okay. Yeah, exactly. Jamila? Don, you want to add anything?
Can you hear me?
Oh, there you go, Jamila. Go ahead. We'll go, Don.
Okay, hi. So the question is that I kind of having a same scenario right now. I'm working with the buyer and I have the representation agreement, which is, of course, 3%. Now, the thing is that we have made an offer for one property and the listing agent told me that we are offering 2.5. I said, okay. So I changed the contract, yes, and I sent them the offer. But I haven't changed the buyer rep right now because we are not sure if they're going to accept it or not. So am I good for now?
Good. Yeah. You can always take less. You may want to amend it so the buyer knows that they're not obligated to pay that extra 0.5% if they pay it.
Yeah, I already mentioned it to the buyer that, since they are not offering me 3%, you might have to. Or I'm okay with that, but definitely I'm just letting you know that this is what is happening.
Yep. Yeah, you're perfectly fine. I would just follow up with the question is the listing broker paying you or is the seller paying you directly? So you know better. But yeah, you're fine.
Okay, thank you.
And then RB. You're muted, by the way. So, Don, want to chime in here while we're waiting?
Can you hear me? Hello?
See, I just have to go to Don, then someone pipes in. Yeah, RB, I hear you.
It's like washing your car so it'll rain.
I was saying, I catch the scenarios, but I do have to read it over and over and over
Yes.
in order to comprehend it. Is there a way, if it's not too complicated, to do kind of a flow chart of this?
Oh, that's a good idea. I'm doing videos, but I can do a flow chart. You know,
Okay.
if this and that type thing. Okay.
Okay. I think it was simplified a little bit more to be able to follow that visual and see what the options are if you do this or whatever, and it might help a little bit.
Right. Okay. That's good.
Thank you.
Yeah. If you don't see it in a week or two, reach out to me and say, "Hey, I'm looking for my flow chart." Just-
Okay.
I might
Thank
get busy, you know, and not get to it. So you know.
I understand. Okay.
Perfect. Anything else, guys? Yeah, you're welcome. That's a good idea, Robbie, by the way. It's good. All right. Well, I'm going to stop recording first of all now.